Crossing the border into any country can seem like a daunting task, especially for those not familiar with crossing borders in general. Those individuals who are familiar with crossing borders, especially into European countries, have seen how easy it can be in some circumstances. Many who cross the US border, though, believe it's completely the opposite to this situation. Border control in the United States can feel unfriendly, and recent reports and travel advisories about US border crossings, especially for foreign nationals, indicate that it could be even more unfriendly under this current Trump administration. Today, we will speak about US immigration and customs, what the law is, and some of the recent reports about changes in how immigration officials interact with foreign citizens coming to the United States. Hi, my name is Evan. I've advised hundreds of travelers about staying safe on trips to locations all over the globe. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to see more. I definitely want to get that subscriber count up just to make sure that people are watching the videos consistently. Before we jump in, I think it's important to understand some of the different US government agencies that you may encounter during travel to and from the United States. So a lot of people will be familiar with these, and this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but we're just going to touch on the three major ones that you'll probably encounter. So the first one is the Transportation Security Administration, otherwise known as the TSA. The TSA's primary responsibility is really to ensure that US transportation systems are safe for people when they travel. So the primary place that you would encounter the TSA would be when you're passing through security in US airports. They usually are the ones who are running the metal detectors and the x-ray machines for your baggage. And then they also may have, employees that would search your luggage or your person if there was a need for that. They don't usually get directly involved in any immigration-related matters, but the one thing I will say about that is they'll verify your identity with an identity check before you actually go through the security line. So if there's any sort of thing that would pop up there, it would be shown in a government system at that point. The next one, which is going to be the one that we speak about probably most today, is Customs and Border Protection. They also have an acronym, CBP, but most people just call them Customs. CBP is responsible for keeping the border safe in the United States. They work on a number of different things, right? So things related to counterterrorism, transnational criminal activity, border security, obviously, facilitating trade in a lawful manner, and then facilitating travel in a lawful manner as well. Most people encounter them entering the US at their first port of entry. So for a lot of people, for example, if you're coming from Europe, you would encounter them when you go through immigration and customs upon your arrival in your first airport in the US. You would always pass through immigration and customs, and the CBP officers are usually going to be the ones that are asking you questions, and then they're also, checking your immigration documents to make sure that you're here legally. They're also verifying, too, that you don't have any illicit or unclaimed items in your baggage. So they also have officers that focus on things like agricultural products that you're not supposed to bring into the US, things like that. They are very much directly involved in immigration matters and pretty much have wide discretion to deny entry to individuals depending on what they perceive is, their particular threat, if they're going to stay longer, if they're, not having enough money to visit the US, if it seems a little shady, things like that is what really they're focused on. And then the last one, which doesn't necessarily operate in a lot of these transport hubs that we traditionally think of, would be Immigration and Customs Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE. So the primary responsibility of ICE is really immigration enforcement, and they also work on combating transnational crime as well. So it's similar to Customs and Border Protection, but they often operate in the interior of the US and really focus on people who've overstayed visas or work permits or green cards, things like that. When there are issues with that, they will directly work with inside the United States. The one thing I'll say is that most people are probably not going to encounter ICE unless they've overstayed a visa or are in the US illegally. That being said, ICE has notoriously pushed the bounds of how they can operate in the United States and enforced against some individuals who do have legal status in the US. So that's called into question a lot of their operations, especially under this new administration. ICE also operates a series of detention facilities around the US, and they're widely responsible for enforcing deportations. So jumping forward to what's happening in present day, especially with people trying to arrive in the United States from different countries, There are broadly two sort of major categories that I would put issues into, but they do have overlap. So you'll see when we actually talk about them. So the first sort of category is increased scrutiny due to uncertain immigration status in the United States, or when you're coming to the US. So a couple things to note, right? Travelers may be encountering higher levels of scrutiny if they're a visa holder entering the US for a certain purpose that may be unclear to the immigration officer. So I just want to preface this with, if you are looking to come to the United States to visit, and it's for various different reasons, you need to make sure that that's very clear within the visa that you select, right? So if it's for business purposes, they tend to be even more scrutinized than tourist purposes, for example. So just keep that in mind. Green card holders do have greater rights due to their status in the United States, but you should make sure that if you have any sort of criminal record or issues with your green card, that you're not actually verified with your immigration status, then you definitely need to, probably avoid leaving the US, just because that's a moment when people have been picked up in recent months when they've come back into the US after that. So just to be clear on that, green card holders, they do have greater rights, but any issues in relation to your green card could cause extra scrutiny at the border as well under this current administration. Visa holders, whether they are students, tourists, or business travelers, right, they just need to make sure that whatever is happening with their visa, once it's granted to you, you're not overstaying that visa. And that could even mean, your flight's delayed and you pick the end of your visa to be the very last day that you're in country. You just need to make sure that you give yourself a little wiggle room, because if you do overstay, that's always a chance that you could get caught up in an issue with Customs and Border Protection or ICE. And then just to provide an example of this, right, and it's a pretty famous one. So in March of this year, 2025, a German national with a valid green card who had lived in the United States for almost a decade was actually detained returning to the US through Logan Airport in Boston, and was sent to an ICE detention facility in Rhode Island. The primary issue that really came up was in relation to a small misdemeanor marijuana charge that was from several years ago that hadn't really caused any trouble. So you can see that increased scrutiny can cause problems for that individual, even though they may be released at a later time. So the second major category is increased scrutiny due to public or personal statements that are against the Trump administration's policies. So this really has come up mostly in relation to searches through mobile devices or other electronics, and also through social media. So, it could be in relation to social media posts, could be in relation to any sort of personal political sentiments about, the US government found within mobile devices when they're going through Customs and Border Protection. And oftentimes in these cases, these people have espoused, anti-Trump rhetoric. So I would say if you are a visa holder entering the US, you should be aware that Customs and Border Protection may request to open your mobile device and look through your phone. You can refuse a mobile device search, but the officer may deny you entry as a result. So if you are refusing the search, just note that you could be sent back to the country that you just came from. For US citizens and green card holders, you have a few more rights, like I mentioned before. So you may refuse a mobile device search, and they are still required to allow you to enter the US. That being said, if you do refuse, it could actually delay your reentry, and they can still attempt to access your phone without the password. So they may, attempt to access it by opening it up and, putting it on some of their systems in order to find information on it. So the example here is really this French scientist who was reportedly denied entry into the US and deported based on personal statements and text messages with some of his colleagues regarding the Trump's administration's research policies that he was studying in particular. The Trump admin did deny the political motivation, but the French government, in response said that it was very concerned that this was the primary reason that they deported him. The last note I'll make on these 2 points is that student visas have been heavily targeted, and the revocation and deportation of international students has been a pretty prominent issue that you probably heard of on the news, with various reports pointing towards international students, especially those who engage in activism and political activities that seem to be against whatever the Trump administration prefers. So I would just say, if you are on a student visa in the United States, you do need to be careful under this current administration. So now we're going to touch on a few tips that I have for crossing the border into the US. So a couple things to do before you go, during the process, and also once you've arrived. So number one, just double check that your visa and your green card are completely valid and there are no immigration issues prior to your departure. So in the terms of a green card, right, if you're leaving the US, going to a different country and planning on coming back, just make sure before you leave the US that everything's taken care of. And the best way to do that is just reach out to whatever immigration lawyer you're working with, just to ensure that everything's okay. For people who are coming to the US from a different country and aren't already present in country, just make sure that your visa is fully valid. It's, for the reason that you intend to come to the US, and that everything seems completely up to snuff at that point. Definitely complete a social media and mobile device cleanse prior to departure. So I would say, if you want to avoid any issues related to some of these sort of political statements that have come out, that have caused problems when crossing the border, just, remove political subjects that could be deemed controversial. I will say that everyone in the US, right, regardless of their, status for immigration, does have a right to free speech. But in terms of immigration customs, the Trump administration has really stretched their ability to deny entrance just on this basis itself. 3, this seems like a really simple one. Use the restroom before going through immigration lines. They can be very, very long, and you don't want to be, in a situation where you're there for 2 hours and you haven't been able to use the restroom. There should always be bathrooms before you enter that line. 4, ensure you know the details of your trip before you're arriving at the officer stand for Customs and Border Protection. So they're likely going to ask you, a few basic questions, and then maybe more depending on, how much more information they need. But some of these include, how long your stay is going to be, where your accommodation is, and what the purpose of your trip is. They're also going to ask, are you meeting other people? Do you have a contact in country? All these different things that, they'll use to identify whether they want to admit you into the US or not. 5, just make sure you answer all of their questions truthfully, right? If it's found that you haven't answered something truthfully, it's much more likely that you're going to have trouble when something comes up. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, but same goes for your customs form as well. 6, do not use your phone when you're with the officer who's checking your immigration status, or the officers that may be checking, your baggage for customs infractions, right? You just want to make sure that you're not using it just because they ask you not to, and also because it's, seemingly rude, or, they can't get the information out of you that they want. The one exception to this would be if they do need additional information that's on your phone. I would just say, oh, do you mind if I check my phone to find that information for you, and I can provide it. Usually they'll probably say yes to that. If you are asked to go through secondary inspection and need legal assistance, you should always have a local contact in country before that has a contact in immigration law, just so that they can reach out to them on your behalf if you are proceeding to the secondary check room. Customs and Border Protection, just so you know, does not actually have to provide you legal representation, right? So, they can, but it's kind of up to their discretion. So you definitely want to have a contact in country who can, potentially reach out on your behalf to an immigration lawyer that then can assist with your particular case if something comes up. If you do end up, needing to go to secondary checks, or even for that primary check, definitely request a translator if you need one, right? You want to be able to communicate properly with them. So, some locations may struggle to deal with your particular native language, depending on what that is, but most of them are going to have, major language translators on hand, or they can call them in. 9, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but fill out your customs form truthfully, right? If it's not truthful, it's more likely that you're going to get some kind of fine entering the country, or there may be some issue. 10, ultimately, if you are not a US citizen or green card holder, the officer that you speak to has the ability to decide whether you may or may not enter the US. So just remember that from the get-go. It is, too bad sometimes when people get turned back. However, they make that ultimate decision, even if you have a valid visa. And then 11, if you have any doubts whatsoever about your immigration status coming into the US, the best thing you can do is reach out to an immigration lawyer before you go. The key is before you go, because at that point, you're going to make sure that you're not going to run into any issues. And, it's peace of mind for you, but also on the off chance that something does come up, right, you'll have an extra contact too with an immigration lawyer. I would highly, highly recommend that if you have any doubts in your mind whatsoever about entering the US, just because people being detained, they end up in places all over the globe at this point because of the policies of the Trump administration. So overwhelmingly, most people have a relatively easy time at the US border. I think, I don't want to be too alarmist in saying these issues could come up, but the reports of them have increased and they've become really prominent because of what's going on. So I would just say, aside from long lines, usually you won't encounter any issues. The biggest issues that come up really are in relation to lack of clear guidance from the Trump administration officials, which makes it a lot harder for people who are entering the US legally to navigate some of the complexities of, being in the US and trying to cross the border. So I would just say trust that all these different travel advisories that different governments are putting out are valid in the sense that, they've received reports from their own citizens that there are issues. And then the last thing I would say, if you need help or have any additional questions about your specific immigration status or immigration case, or if you're planning on coming to the US and you need additional information, you should absolutely reach out to an immigration lawyer for that information. They're going to be the ones to provide the best information for you on your specific case. With that being said, either way, I really hope that people are able to continue to visit the US. It is my home country, and I do really enjoy seeing a lot of people come and visit. Tourism is a big part of our economy. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments. With that, I'll leave you there, but thanks so much, and have a good rest of your day.